All right. Welcome, everybody. Um, Welcome to the stream. Today, I'm going to be continuing on with the project that I was working on last time. And for those of you who weren't watching last time, welcome. But for those of you who weren't watching last time, it's a project that I've been kind of thinking about, talking about for a long time. An open source project. Good morning, Swami. We've got Andrew Swam in the house. Um, it's a project that I've been talking about for a long time, and it has to do with basically doing two-way binding with React and MobX. So I'm sure pretty much everybody has heard about React. If you haven't heard about MobX, it's a great way to manage state, to do state management in pretty much any framework, in JavaScript framework. Um, it goes along great with React, but you can also use it in Angular, Vue, anything else. The MobX itself doesn't have anything to do with client side or any browser framework. MobX itself is just kind of an observable framework. You can think about like RxJS, that kind of thing, where you just make objects and observe changes in them and react to them. And then there is MobX React, which allows those bindings to React to kind of use those observables and update your components whenever those observables change. So what I have been looking into, let me just switch to the code. Let's switch off my ugly face here and I'll just show the code. What I have been working on and kind of using for a long time at work is the idea of, I've got a form here. Right, and so let me see. I used to, in the last stream, I had an example of how you would do this with regular React. So in regular React, you have your input field, and you set your value. So if I wanted to set this to the username, I would say store.username, or let's say billing address username. Right? So I would bind that to the username. That's how you kind of bind it and display the value. And so if I were to save this and run this is just some stupid project that I made, some demo project. If I were to save this and run this is what you would call kind of one-way binding. It's kind of useless. It is setting the value of this input field to a value in this store object that I didn't show you, but that's okay. Here we go. So this is the form we're looking at, and this is the username, right? So it's setting this value to the store object, or the value of this input field to the value of the store object. But when I do something, it doesn't change because React, regardless of what I do, always sets the value. It's kind of hard-coded, right? And so the way that you react to these changes is listen to the onChange handler, and you just do like a standard event handler, like you do in HTML, a standard DOM event handler. So this is the event, and in the event you have the target and current value, right? So that's the current value, the thing that I just typed, and then you do something right with that, right? So in this example, it would be set it. Right, let's get this chat out of here. You'd be set the value, right? So I save that, reload. Right, now I can change it to whatever I want. Everything I just showed you, that is just basic React. That's not even MobX. So MobX really just kind of takes care of when I do something like this, when I assign this value, MobX is taking care, and MobX React is taking care of re-rendering the React component in the background. That's where MobX comes into play. So that's just kind of basic 101 recap of what I did. So what I did last time is I wrapped all of that into a component. So that behavior is in this bound input component. And this is the component that I'm looking to kind of publish as an open source project at some point, right? Because this is something that is very reusable, something that a lot of people can use. And so basically I just took that, right? There's my input field, and I assign the value, and I listen to the onChange, and I update that, right? Now I've got a formatter and parser because the value, if I hover over here, it only takes strings. And that is to say HTML input boxes only take string values, right? That's the only valid value of the string property in HTML is a string. And so if I give it a Boolean value or a number value or something else, then you have to format that to a string on the way in to display it. And then on the way out, you have to kind of parse that value, that string value, back to that original thing. I also did some cool stuff with TypeScript here, right? So this is all just kind of, this part all here, right here, is just kind of React stuff. You have props and everything. The cool TypeScript thing that I showed is this right here. So I have team model. So I have a model property, which if you look here, there's my model property. Let's do this side by side. So I have my model property, and what I want to do, and I also have this property, and this should be only restricted to the valid properties of the object that I am showing. In other words, if I were to go in here in TypeScript, and I get full kind of autocomplete, right? These are all of the options that I can choose, aka all of the properties on this object. And so now what I want to do right here is, even though this is a string value, I still want to restrict the values of that string to the names of the properties on that object. And the way that I accomplished this was, get this chat, let me put the chat on the other screen. The way that I accomplished this is with this TypeScript type guard right here. tprop, in other words, the value of this property, tprop extends key of tmodel, right? So this is the magic here. So whatever type model is here, tmodel is, which is just whatever type I pass in as the value of the model field, right? It kind of infer that. Take that and then enumerate the properties or the keys on that model. And so those are the valid values for tprop, for this property. Right, so that's where we get this super cool IntelliSense or autocomplete option here, so we can kind of limit our choices there. So that's that. So that's what I did in the last stream. I built out this component, and so in this stream, when I was testing it last time, I would kind of switch back and forth, right? And I would edit something in here and make sure it was updated and all that. In this stream, I am going to look at my chat messages. Who just said something? How do you wire the props to the IntelliSense? Well, so that's TypeScript and React, right? So this is just kind of a, nope, that's, yeah, that is the one that I wanted to do. Okay, so this is basic kind of React and TypeScript 101, right? So here's a very simple example. I can actually simplify it even more. Bound input is my React component. So a React component can be as simple as a function that returns JSX, returns HTML. Looks like HTML, but it's really JSX, right? That's kind of the React style, right? So this represents a DOM element. This observer right here is part of the MobX framework. You wrap anything that you want to observe that has properties or values that will change. So in this example, model is actually an observable property with MobX. It's an observable object. So anytime this value changes, MobX, specifically the observer component here, will observe that and re-render the contents of this, right? And so with React, you have the basic signature here is you have a function with properties, right? And those properties have a type. So here I'm assigning the type of bound input props, right? Tmodel, tprop, and I have all these generic parameters and all of that thing. This other one, I'm also adding a union of input props because ultimately, extended, cool. Thanks for the follow. That's awesome. Welcome. Here I also have, I'm adding input props because ultimately input props being the props for an HTML input element, because I'm ultimately passing all of those down, right? So if I go to my examples down here, that's how I'm able to add things like required and autocomplete. These are not my properties. These are just properties on the input field, aka the input props right here, right? Which I just copied and pasted from the React type definitions. So anyway, back to Swami's questions. How do you wire the props to the IntelliSense? This is how, right? So React knows that all of the properties in this object are available as properties here, right? And so I kind of have a list of all the things that I can do because that's extracted from these guys, right? And then I get full IntelliSense on that, right? And that's where all of this coolness comes into play and restricting the property and everything. Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah, no, it is super slick. I mean, React and TypeScript, I love it. I love it. I love it. It took me a while to just get over the HTML and JavaScript, combining that together. But once I got over that kind of separation of concerns question, totally love it. I mean, I am totally in love with React and TypeScript. This won't work with nested props though. You mean this model binding? Yeah, no, absolutely not. So we'll get into that. He also Duckworth also said, let's see, it's like Formic, library, or Redux forms. Kind of. So we're getting there. So the problem with those, so that is true. Let's see. So there is Formic. Let's look at some other kind of competitors to what I'm building out here. So there's Formic, and there is the one I'm looking at actually. What was it? React Hook Forms or something like that. React Hook Form. This is the one I really like right now. So these are just different ways of basically doing what I'm showing right now. The problem with these things is they're not, they don't really bind really well with MobX, right? So they don't really allow you to give you all the cool things that I'm showing in terms of the autocomplete and all of that stuff. So my solution, honestly, I'm going to kind of do it on the stream, and it will probably evolve into something a lot like React Hook Form because I really do love this approach. And ideally, I end up with an approach that allows me to basically just use React Hook Form. So I'm not competing with this. I use their validation and forms and everything, but kind of figure out a way to bind it with MobX. But forgetting about all of that right now, the topic of this session is I have this component. Let me undo all these changes I was doing while I was talking. Let me actually just undo everything. There we go. Yeah. So the topic of this episode of the stream is really testing of all this stuff, right? So like I said, the way that I was testing it before is I would switch back to this page, I would make a change and make sure that it was bound. And I would know that it worked because when I type a letter in here, it updates the value. Because if it didn't do that full circle, then I would type a letter and nothing would happen, right? And then I would know it was broken. But that's really not a great way to test stuff. So let's do some automated tests. So today I'm going to be doing automated tests with Jest. I'm going to create my test file. Bound input dot, I like to call them spec.tsx. Okay, so note that I'm using the TSX because it is a TypeScript file. So it's TS and then X, meaning I'm going to be doing some JSX in here. So now in my test, I'm actually going to be, using JSX. I'm actually going to be rendering my component using JSX in my tests. So I'll just kind of stub out, describe with Jest. And I'm testing the bound input component. And why is it yelling at me? Isolate. Oh, okay, because I'm not importing anything. Import React from React. There we go. Okay. It should display the value of a bound property. Okay, so bound input should display the value of a bound property. In other words, that looks like, I'll just do pseudocode right now. I'm going to say bound input model equals something that I got to make, a property first name. So that's what I'm going to render, and then I'm going to make sure that that works, right? So I'm going to say expect that let's say the input, I'm just writing pseudocode right now, right? Rendered input has value form data dot first name, right? So that's going to be my test. That's what it's going to look like. So now let me move my chat over here so it's in my vision. If anybody has anything. All right, so how I'm going to do that? Well, first I'm going to input my component, obviously. And then I'm going to use a library that is called, what's it called? React testing library. Testing library / React. So testing library, let me see if I can, it's the easiest way to do this. Testing library, do I have a link in here? Come on, there we go. Testing library is a super cool library. It actually, I'm using the React version of it. There's a bunch of them. There's basically anything that you test in the DOM. There's DOM testing library, and then on top of that, he has wrappers for, and by he I mean Kent C. Dodds, which if you don't follow him, you definitely should. If you there's the DOM testing, and then on top of that is React, Reason, Native, Vue. There's a whole bunch of other ones: Marker, Angular, Preact, Svelte, Cypress, Puppeteer. Right, so you got a whole bunch of cool stuff on here. So this is definitely a kind of multi-use library. Super cool, super easy to use. What I did skip is that, well, I didn't skip it. It was in the last stream. But if you look at this. My package JSON, this was the result of, I used create React app to create this application, right? So I just kind of did, let me get a new command line here. I just did mpx create React app, my app name, app, and then I used the template TypeScript. The TypeScript template. So that's the application that I'm using here. And so it scaffolded all this stuff out for me, including the React scripts that are running my site, and including the ESLint config, and it also included the testing library, kind of automatically, or it includes those packages with the create React app template. So it's already there, and we start using it. So let's see what happens when we start using it. So in here, there is a render function. So in order to render this, I'm simply going to call render. Now it's complaining because I haven't defined this yet. So let's define this. So let's say form data is form data, and this will be I'll add some more properties later. And then I will initialize this before each. Form data equals first name. Let's just say that's me. Okay. So because this is all about MobX and observables and reactions and everything, the whole point of this is that I'm bounding. I mean, I don't have to use MobX for this, right? This would work. It should work. I mean, I can finish writing this test and it will prove that it will work. But since the whole focus of this library is to make it easier working with MobX observables, I will use that. So I'll just turn this into an observable. So again, if you're familiar with libraries like RxJS, this just basically wraps this object as an observable object, and then I can observe any changes to its properties. So when I change the property first name, as this input will do, we can react to that. Shwami asks, it and before each, is that the testing library? No, not at all. That is this is Jest. Jest, describe, before each, it, or test, or aliases. That is all Jest. And Jest uses, I think, what is this? The Mocha. These are actually Mocha keywords, I think. There's actually they're implemented by Jest, I think, is the simple answer. But Jest actually implements it's kind of more of a standard thing. I think it's kind of like it's called the describe schema or something like that. There's multiple frameworks that implement these methods in this style of testing, is what I'm trying to say. But I'm using Jest. Again, where and how am I using Jest? Well, it was installed for me it was set up when I ran the Create React app, and I actually have a Jest extension in here. Jest extension in here for VS Code to run them. So that's how I'm going to be running them. You also notice when I switched over there, I have another extension too called Testify. So the Jest extension adds this kind of automatic running. So it'll look for Jest test in my project and automatically run them and automatically kind of give that check mark, right? So that's how this happened while I was talking. The VS Code and that plugin ran these tests, said, you're cool. Oh. And it gave me that check mark. If I go and I change these tests or I change the code that they're testing, it'll automatically run it again and, fail it or whatever. Testify is another extension I have that actually gives this. Let me see. Let me disable Testify and see what happens. Disable. Shwami says, so I can use Jest for any JS or TS testing? Absolutely. Absolutely. Jest is an amazing framework. Right. Okay. So I disabled Testify, and so the Jest extension here gives this what's this called? Live the lens command to basically be able to run my test. And it's funny. So you see that it went away. Right. So the only time that command, that debug command, actually let me run this test shows is when it's either hasn't run yet or when it's broken. But if I wanted to run this passing test, I couldn't. It wouldn't let me. So that's why I installed this one, Testify, which is a very cool extension, which just adds this run test and debug test options up here so I can run them. And this actually runs them in the command line, right? So if I click on this, this will run the single test. I can run the whole suite up here, right? So that failed, unsurprisingly. Okay, so let's see. So look at this. Unexpected reserve word interface. Basically, it's saying I have no idea what interface is. What it's really saying is you're using TypeScript and I have no idea what that is. So unfortunately, the CRA, Create React Act template, doesn't fully configure TypeScript for testing out of the box, unfortunately. So what it does under the scenes is it hides a lot of that configuration for you. It's actually using a Babel config. It's using Webpack config. It's using a whole bunch of stuff under the covers, which you don't see, and that's kind of by design. But you can change some config, right? Like you can change your TypeScript settings by modifying the tsconfig file. You can add your own Babel config. I think it's babelrc.config.js. Something like that. And you can create your own Babel, maybe it's just babel.config. I don't know. I'll get back to that in a minute. I'll find the right name. And in here you can have your Babel Babel config.js. Yeah, that's what I thought. Oh, yeah, I said .babel. There you go. Thank you, Duckworth. So let's go in here. So if we say Babel Jest, under the covers, it's using Babel Jest. And if we go in here to the Babel Jest web page, we can basically copy what the Create React app is doing. Let me open this up in Explorer. If I go to React scripts, we can look at, where is it? So, whoops, no, I wanted to open that. You can kind of see what they're doing under the covers. So this is the Babel config that they make, right? Which is very simple. It just has one plugin or preset. And I can just copy that, which is pretty much what this shows here, right? So I'm going to, all right. So Babel preset React is the preset that has all of this stuff. I think it, whoops, it also has TypeScript, I believe. So this should be all I need to do. So again, the whole reason I'm doing this is so that I can run jest from the command line. When I run it in the browser, it kind of understands the create React app config, and that's why this is passing. When I run it from the command line, it doesn't for some reason. And this should make that work. Yes? Good. So we're all good. So when I run from the command line, it kind of expects that Babel config to be there. So I basically just copied the one that was being generated, right? And so now this is the one we're going to be using going forward. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, just kind of a roadblock. Now let's actually test this, right? So I have a passing test, which really, it doesn't mean it works. It means it's just not failing. It's not throwing an exception. So let's make it pass. Let's make it a real test. So when I render this, it's going to give me some output, right? So I'm going to save that output or destructure that output into some variables. So I got a couple of helpers here. Again, so now we're back to, this is React testing library, right? The output of this render function isn't just giving me the HTML or the DOM element or whatever. It's giving me functions that I can query. And this is by design. It's like deliberately, I'll call it inflexible, I guess. But it's really kind of trying to push you into best practices, right? Fall into the pit of success, avoid the stuff that you really shouldn't be doing. So, I mean, I lied. It does give you the container. It does give you the element. So you do have access to those things that you can query, but you're not really supposed to. You really want to use these methods. Find by role, get by role. So I'm going to be looking at these get by methods. So these are interesting because there's a very limited one. Notice what is not here. Get by ID, get by name. These are all things that are really kind of anti-patterns. They're bad practices. You should be, and they're bad practices in the idea of, and Kent C. Dodds has blog posts on this, so I'm really just regurgitating what he said. But you really should be interacting with your components not based on the way that they're implemented, like their DOM element IDs, but the way the user or the browser interacts with them, right? So a user will find an input with the placeholder first name. Right? And the user is going to find that, and it's going to prompt them to enter their first name. They're going to enter it in there. So that's how we're going to test it, right? So we're going to say get by placeholder text. That's the function that we're going to get out of here. And so that'll be the rendered component. So this will be the instance of my rendered component. And this is just a DOM element. If we hover over that, it's an HTML element, right? So now I can go and I can uncomment this. And this is not the correct thing. Has value. Okay, so the React testing framework also has some matchers. I don't know if it is actually called value. It has value. It might be. If we look in here with the set up, maybe the usage, we should be able to, let's see. At some point, I've got to import something to bring in those matchers. There we go. So in my test, I'll import the extend expect from the testing library. And so again, this is not specific to React. It's actually specific to Jest DOM. And so what this does, it's matchers. It's Jest matchers in the testing library that get attached to the expect. So you can have now value to have value, not has value, but to have value, right? So now we have a whole bunch of DOM specific matchers in here. To be in the DOM, to be in the document. I'm sure there's a list of them in here. Not really sure where it is, but the element will be input element, so you can just check the value. Yeah, so you could. Right. So what Duckworth just said is you can have element. Well, so element right now is an HTML element. I can actually cast it to, I think, what is it, input? Is it HTML input element? Yeah. So that may or may not work, but once I have that, I can say value, right? And so I could just say expect value to be, right? And not use these matchers. Yeah. I could do that. Absolutely could do that. So I do prefer these kind of more expressive to have value. So this is just a personal preference to me. I definitely, rather than kind of dealing with casting and things like that, I do like to have these kind of more expressive matchers that explain, literally just spell out in English, expect element to have value first name. So now when I save this, we should run. See, it's running tests. And this will be underwhelming because it's already passing. So it should just continue to pass if I did this right. Yeah, good. So we're all good, right? Should display the value of a bound property. So this is the very simple test that just shows when I bind this to something and that already has a value, you should show that value. They should match, right? Let's copy that test. Let's get a little better. So that's kind of the in, right? Setting the value. So now should update the bound model or bound property, the value of the bound property. Whoops. Oh, I accidentally reduced my screen size. Let's see. There we go. Of the bound value of the bound property when the input value changes. Sorry, I know you can't read that. Okay. So this is the other way around now, right? So my initial render is still the same. And then this continues to be relevant, but I'll just add. Now I want to edit it, right? So this is, again, I'm switching back to React testing library. So the way that React testing library interacts or sets values on input fields is very explicitly. Frankly, I don't really like it. So if you're using something like Selenium, you would say like change text or something like that, right? And you would put in the new text. But the way that the way that React testing framework does it is with something called fire event, and then you tell it which event to fire. So we're firing the change event. We're targeting the element, that input element, and then this is the part I don't like. We're actually kind of building that event manually, and this is where you can. I mean, it's literally an object that you can do whatever you want with, and so you could actually make an event that you're not actually matching what's happening in the DOM, which is really unfortunate, but whatever. It is what it is. So now I'm setting the value to Allie. So now, and then when we're all done, we should expect this will fail. Well, sure. I mean, that's still legitimate. They'll still be the same, but what we really want is to make sure that first name equals Allie. So now if I save this, it'll run. Running tests. This should turn green check mark if I've done it right. That's okay. That's a red check mark. Okay, so now the received value must be an H. Oh, not to have value. To be. because now I'm testing the object, not the element. It's got to run again. There you go. Green check mark. Works. So now, if you were watching the chat, you saw that Duckworth pointed this out. It is a green. It's a check mark. It's a passing test. It works. But if I run this, you'll see there's actually kind of more to the story. There's a warning here. So even though that worked, React testing library doesn't really like that I did that. What happened? It should have yelled at me. I don't know why it didn't. Let's see if I can get it to yell at me. Interesting. Anyway, so what I'm expecting it to do is yell at me that you need to wrap this in an act. So this is simply a function that you can wrap your changes to. So whenever you are making changes or interacting with the browser, you generally want to wrap it in an act to kind of very explicitly call that out. So if I save this and run it, it should continue to run and work just fine, because really I just gave it more information about what I'm doing. I told it I am making changes here. Frankly, when I ran through this earlier, it did give me that warning. I'm surprised that it's not giving me that warning. But basically, anytime it gives you that warning, this is what it's talking about. It's saying that you should wrap it in act. Okay, cool. Oh, okay, yeah. So here we go. So Duckworth's explaining it. Yeah, that will wait for state updates on any new registered hooks. Right. So let's jump in and see what he is saying here. So the reason that I got that error the last time I did it is because the last time I did it, I was using it on a kind of a more advanced component. In other words, one that had state. So what can I do here? Let's get back to that. Let's get back to that. So I'm going to remove this. Let's get back to that in a little bit. So it's continuing to work now. Let's keep going forward. Okay, what else should this component do? So now I've done the two-way binding, right? So given this, right, when I render this component, the value should be the value of this property, the first name property on form data. That's cool. That worked. When I edit it or when I change it, it should update that value back on the object. That works. So basically, we're testing two-way binding. So what else can happen? Let's see. If I go back here. So these are all strings right now. And so that's super easy, right? Because strings, you have no formatting, you have no parsing, you have nothing. So what happens now, I'm going to wrap both of these tests in a description, and I'm going to say describe for string values. Right? So what I was really testing with these two tests is string values. Now let me copy both of these tests again, and we'll say for number values. So for number values, the same thing should be the same. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to add a new property up here on form data, and I'm going to say, whatever, count is a number. Count is equal to, let's call it 10. So now, should display the value of the bound property. So now we say count. Got to change those, the placeholder. And I'm actually going to go ahead and change the type here to number. I'll get back to that. Yeah, this should be good. I'm going to change this to have value count. So this will fail. That'll fail. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this test again. Okay. All right, so now when I save these, both of these are going to fail, and I will talk about why they just failed. They should fail. Yeah, okay. So let's take a look. Expected the element to have value 10, received 10. Sounds like it should work, right? But what is really happening here is that equality, right? So it's kind of parsing. Let me see if I get a better, if I run this in the console, if the error message is a little more obvious. Let's see what happens. There we go. So there's a little more obvious, right? Well, this is weird. This is 10 and received 10, but this is a little more obvious of what is happening here. Expected the number for, received the string for, right? Again, so that the underlying problem here is all of my string test worked because I'm just passing in strings and the value or the property, the type of the property was a string. So there's no parsing, there's no formatting needed to go back and forth. But now I need both. I need to format a number to a string in order for it to be a valid value on the value prop, right? Because we take strings. Even though the type says it takes a number, that's not actually true. That's a different thing. In order to actually display it in the browser, it needs to be a string. And so I need to format. I need to format that number to a string in order for this test to work. So I'll go ahead and do that. So if we can see my kind of default formatter here, these are properties that I can pass in. So without changing this code, I can actually pass these in my test, and it should work. Actually, let's go ahead and try that first. Well, not for the string values, for the. So I can say formatter equals. That should just work, and then parser. So these are actually numbers in the ES6. Well, I don't know if it ES6, ES5. In the ECMAScript API, these are numbers. So there's the string constructor and the number constructor. These should just work as functions. So when it's coming in, format the number to a string. When it's going out, parse the string into a number. Cool. Thanks for dropping by, Duckworth. Go ahead and subscribe, man, so you get notifications for next time. All right, let's see. Does this work? No? Okay, let's try it down in here. Let's see if this works. If I change it. Did that work? Okay, so that one worked, right? So just adding that parser worked. And again, the error there, thanks, Duckworth. See you later, man. Thanks for following. Again, the issue there was this whole string versus number thing, right? So the error specifically was when I ran this code, when I changed the value and executed this, even though I was parsing, I was using that default parser, which is this is a really complex way of simply saying just pass through the value, right? Whatever you gave me, I'm going to give it back to you. No, I don't want to be famous or buy followers or primes. I want to ban this person. There you go. So what this is assigning is that string value back, right? So I was formatting it. This all went fine because my default formatter is the string. So this is actually redundant in my test. I don't need that at all. And then when I parsed it back, it was just giving me that string value back. It was assigning this value to a string value, which is totally fine because remember, in TypeScript, you're just describing what you expect the thing to be. This has no runtime effect. This doesn't make sure that count is always a number. So when I use JavaScript on the browser to assign it back to a value, the browser can assign it to a string, a boolean, a symbol, whatever, right? An object. There's no stopping that at runtime. And so that was that error. Frankly, I don't really know what's going on with this error. Let's see. Oh, okay. So this is the other way around. Expect element to have value count. So this is an error with my test. And I don't need the parser because I'm not doing any parsing. This is just displaying the value, right? So I don't need the parser here. So this will never be true, right? So anytime to have value, this always has to be a string, and I'm passing in a numeric value. So this is a problem with my test. So I actually need to wrap this in my test. So expect the value of the input element to be the value of count, but the string value. Once I save this, run the test, everything's good. I don't know why I'm getting the check marks. I should, but I'll run these tests just to show that they are passing. So there we go. Okay, so now that's with the parser. So should update the value of a bound property when the input value changes and parser is specified. Let's copy this test and give it some default behavior. Remove that parser. So this should just work. Oh, my formatting kind of messed stuff up. Where are we? This is the test that we're doing here. So this should just work. In other words, it doesn't right now. But this is what I want to do, right? Like ideally, I don't want to have to parse every value that I pass in. I would expect this component to be smart enough to see that I'm passing in a numeric value, parse that value to a string for me, and then when somebody enters in a new value in that field, parse that numeric value back out and assign. Don't overwrite my numeric value with a string value, but actually do that proper parsing, right? So this test fails because the component doesn't do that. But rather than fix the test, let's fix the component right now. So we can do this in a couple ways, right? I think one of the ways is, and this is getting into a little bit of React, right? So this function is called every single time that one of these values changes. And because I'm using mobx in the observer, it's actually re-rendered and re-executed every single time the value of this property changes that I'm observing. So every time that happens, all of this code is going to execute. So what I can do here is I'm allowing you to pass in a custom format or a custom parser. This should actually only happen the first time that the component is rendered. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but so I'm going to capture that into a state. So use state is just a React hook. I'm not going to get into that, but that's just kind of that's how React works. What is value? What's going on here? Why? Oh, it implicitly has any type. That is just a TypeScript error that I'm going to go and disable because I will allow implicit any's because that's fine. Okay. All right. Same deal here. I'll react or use a use state. And again, I'm not going to kind of explain what this is. This is just basic React hooks. If you don't know what's going on there, you can check out the React hooks docs over here. That will tell you everything about use state and all of that. But basically, the simple answer is the first time that this component is run, this doesn't have a value, and so it's going to execute this function to figure out what that value is going to be. It's going to give it back to me in this parameter, and then every other time, the subsequent times that this function executes, like on a re-render, it will just use the value that it previously had. So this will run the first time, and then subsequent times it'll just give me back that value. Okay, so now I can look at, I can be a little more intelligent about my parser, right? So right now I say either use the one that was passed in, that's an optional property, or use this default parser, which as I said earlier is just a pass-through. So this only really works for strings. But what I can do is I can say, here are all the parsers. I can make an object here. And I can go by type. So I can say, give me the parser for type of model property. So at runtime, when I bind this to a value, go and find the type of that value. That's going to be string, number, boolean, symbol, whatever, right? Or object. Go and find the type of that value and then go and basically do kind of a lookup in this object. So this object is going to have a bunch of names, right? So string, what is the parser that I'm going to use for a string? It's the one that I just showed. Take what you gave and respond back with that, right? Number. Number is actually going to be the parser. So parsing a number is going to be string. It's going to be number. Sorry. Parsing is parsing back out. And then when I did this last time, let's see. When I did this last time, TypeScript was yelling at me that I didn't have all the types. I'm trying to get that error back. I wonder if maybe it was due to this. Let's see if this makes a difference. There we go. Cool. Okay. Yeah, okay. So now it's basically saying, look, if you're going to use this as a lookup, then every possible value of type of model property should be represented in that lookup, right? So in other words, here's all the possible values. It's string type, number type, big int type, boolean, symbol, undefined, object, function. These all need to be there in order for this error to go away. And that's cool. That's good, right? Like these are all of the use cases, even if I don't necessarily intend to support them, they're the possible values that could be passed in. So let's get rid of the obvious, right? So undefined. So when there's undefined, the callback or the parser that I'm going to use is the actual throw an exception, right? Throw error. Not supported. And I need to wrap this in a function there. So that's my function. That's my quote-unquote parser function, is really just to throw an error. So what are some other things that are unsupported? Undefined is clearly not supported. Actually, undefined that's going to be our pass-through here. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Well, I'll tell you why right now. Undefined is if I try to bind to a value that doesn't actually exist yet. I haven't set that yet. It will get undefined. Then my parser is, well, I don't really know what it is, so I'm going to pass it through. I'll just assume that it's a string or whatever, right? And so I'll let that go. But what is going to be unsupported is object. Oh, come on. Object is going to be unsupported. And function is going to be unsupported, so you can't render a function, you can't bind a function. Also, symbol is going to be unsupported. What was the other one? Big int. Big int is just going to be a number. I'm going to use the number parser. This is giving me that any. So I just need to do that. Get rid of that error. What am I missing? I'm missing boolean. Okay, so there's all my parsers. And that's happy now, because I've got one for everything, right? So any type that this type could be has a has an associated parser registered here. So this is going to, the very first time this component is rendered, the very first time this component is rendered, it's going to look at that value. If it has a value, it's going to look it up here. Otherwise, if it doesn't have a value, I'll just use this basic pass-through. And then I will set that. Let's see. So this should change also whenever the model property changes as well. So let's see. In other words, if it starts out as undefined and then gets a value, this should update as well. So now if I save all of this, go back and run my test. Let's see. This should succeed. All right. Well, I got a check mark down here. This check mark isn't updating, but just by the fact that it's not giving me an error indicates that it does work. Any questions on this? This is about it. I mean, I'm gonna about wrap up. So, I mean, this is basic testing. I know I didn't do very many kind of advanced test cases. Let's see. Am I getting that? Am I getting that warning? I'm still not getting that ACT warning. That's fine. But this is pretty much it. Let me run all of my tests just to make sure. And we will see. If you got any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. If not, thank you for joining. I think I'll wrap up now. So this code is just on my local machine right now. It's really just kind of a local repo that I made to kind of flesh out this idea because it's more of a POC. But as we move on, I'm probably going to move this code out into its own library because, like I said, it's going to be, I want it to be an open source library that I'm going to actually publish and maintain. And so we'll move this bound input component and the bound input test. We'll move that into another repo, and I will publish that repo to GitHub. So this code that we're looking at is not available anywhere on the internet other than my local machine and on previous recordings of this stream. So you can look at it there. But in the next couple of weeks, as we flesh it out, it will be available, and I will share that link. So yeah, thank you all for joining. If you liked what you saw and you're not a subscriber, please give me a subscribe. I'm looking to get those subscriber numbers up. I only recently started streaming a couple weeks back, so I'm just starting out. Don't have many followers yet, so you could be one of the first 30 followers. you still qualify for that if you subscribe now. So thank you very much. I'm going to try and stick to this schedule every Friday, 10:30, 11. I think it'll kind of bounce back and forth. But if you join at 11. I'll be streaming. You may be a little bit late, but I'll be streaming every Friday. That's what I'm shooting for. So thanks for joining. I'll see you next week.